Today, I'm going to be talking about a wonderful dreamer, and I'm going to be using her experience as a dreamer to explain the third step in using your dreams and the messages you get from your subconscious mind to improve your conscious life. And the person I'm talking about is Harriet Tubman. So, hello. It's Carol Ann Chapman. And already in these live streams, I've been talking about the first two steps in working with your dreams. And the first one is to remember your dreams. Then the second one is to interpret your dreams. Now, today we're going on to the third step. And Harriet Tubman is a wonderful example of how to do that. I imagine you know who Harriet Tubman is, but for those of you who don't, I want to tell you a little bit about her. And I also want to explain that, Harriet Tubman was nicknamed Moses. And that's because she led her people to safety and freedom. And that was out of the enslavement that they were experiencing in the United States. Now, if you've seen some of my other videos, you'll know that I'm originally from Canada. And I was born there and I grew up there and I got married, had my children there, and came to the United States later in life. So my experience or my understanding of who Harriet Tubman is slightly different, since it was Canada that provided the safety and freedom for the slaves that Harriet Tubman was able to lead to freedom. And in fact, I grew up and lived in the part of Canada where she brought the slaves. And I remember from an early age learning a little bit about Harriet Tubman. And the main thing I remember from my youth was that I was told that she brought people across the train bridge in Niagara Falls. Now, I live very close to Niagara Falls, and Niagara Falls is, I don't know if it's the largest, certainly an extremely mighty waterfall, terrifying waterfall, gorgeous waterfall. And presently, there is a bridge that goes from Niagara Falls, New York, to Niagara Falls, Canada. But evidently, the slaves came across the railroad bridge. Now, my experience of a railroad bridge, and this is not in Niagara Falls, it's in the small town where I grew up. And in that small town, we had a railroad bridge across the Welland Canal. Now, that bridge was one of those bridges where the trestles have spaces between them. And it was a bridge that was way high up in the air. It was sort of closer to the water in the canal. But because it had spaces, the thought of these poor people being so desperate to be free that they would go across a bridge, and usually at night, that they would go across this bridge with these huge big holes between the trestles. I was like, oh my God, it must have been terrible. But it turns out that is not the kind of bridge they went across. The railroad bridge they went across was a beautiful bridge over the Niagara Gorge. That's the other thing. The Niagara Gorge is where the whirlpool is after Niagara Falls goes over the falls area, and then it makes this whirlpool. And I think that's where Superman saves people from the whirlpool. In any case, this bridge, because Harriet Tubman was taking people across in the 1850s, the bridge at that time was a two-tiered bridge. And on top, the trains went, and underneath, horse and buggies and pedestrians walked. Still, it was a very, very high bridge over this gorge with swirling, scary water. As a kid, we always went to Niagara Falls for picnics and other excursions. And looking down there as a kid, it was pretty darn scary for me, and it still is. It's just the power of nature in that area is phenomenal. So I'm trying to think, I've got notes here. It that bridge was called the Niagara Falls Suspension Bridge, and it was there between 1855 to 1897 until the wood decayed, because there's always this mist coming up out of the falls and the whirlpool. And so the bridge, that original bridge, had to be taken down, and they put up the Whirlpool Rapids Bridge in 1897. And that bridge is still there. These are beautiful bridges that go over the Niagara River at various places. Now, she also brought people across on the Bertie Street Ferry from Buffalo, New York to Fort Erie, Canada. So this was on a ferry, and the bridge there, which is now exists, it's the Peace Bridge. And this is the way when I go home, I take that bridge from Buffalo to Fort Erie. And then in Fort Erie, you're in the Niagara Peninsula. And this is where Harriet Tubman took the fleeing slaves. So the slaves, when they got to this ferry over the Niagara River, the whole time that she took them on what was called the Underground Railroad, and it was called underground not because it was physically underground, but because it was underground from what people knew. So it was hidden. So she would take these fleeing slaves to homes that secretly took them in and cared for them and protected them from the authorities. Because you see, what had happened originally, Harriet Tubman and other people who led slaves to freedom, they would take them from the southern states where the slaves were enslaved, and they would bring them to the northern states where it was safer and there was not as much legislation making slavery legal. However, in 1850, a law was passed saying that any slave that fled his or her owner or master would have to be returned. And it was precarious, these trips they took. She evidently usually transported people in the winter and at night, because when it was cold out, the owners were likely to stay in their homes. Of course, that meant that the fleeing slaves would be fleeing in cold weather. And hopefully she'd find a place for them to stay where they could warm up over, or in the daytime, they could sleep before they left the next night. So the interesting thing is that I didn't know this until I did this research, that when they went across the ferry, the people who were hunting the fleeing slaves, they were merciless. And some of them even lurked around the ferry trying to capture a runaway slave at the last minute before they got on the ferry and all the way across to Canada. So evidently the ferrymen had these various codes, and I don't know if they were words they used or if they scratched their forehead or whatever. They had these sort of secret codes to let other workers on the ferry know that there was what they consider a suspected bad guy who was trying to recapture these slaves and take them back into bondage. So, like I said, my experience of the slave trade, because I grew up in Canada, was of a tradition of providing sanctuary for them. Now, it's not like Canada never had legalized slavery. Slavery in Canada was abolished in 1834. And in the United States, it was not abolished until after the Civil War, which was, I think, 1865. So Harriet Tubman was bringing people into Canada between 1850, when this new law came that that even in the North, that in any state in the Union, that a fleeing slave had to be returned to its owner. So that's when she had to up her her program and take them into the safety of Canada. So it turns out that Harriet Tubman herself had a home in Canada between 1850 and 1860. That's 10 years. And she had her home in St. Catharines, Ontario, which was close to the American border, but not that close that maybe someone could capture you. And interestingly enough, St. Catharines is where I went to university at Brock University. And I also owned my first house in St. Catharines. And my house was just a 4-minute drive from Salem Chapel, which is where Harriet Tubman went to church. It was a church that um, the free slaves had built, and they worshiped there, and she worshiped there as well. So by chance, my life has sort of dovetailed a little bit with the history of Harriet Tubman in Canada. So now, this was something I saw online, that when she brought people over to Canada, she'd say to them, "Shout, you are free." And they would, and then some of them would kiss the ground and exclaim, "This is British soil." So that's cool. All right. Now, there's also, I'm just looking over here, when I look over here, looking at my notes. There's also, in 2015, the Harriet Tubman Public School was built on Henry Street, and the now free slaves in Canada made a sort of community in the Henry Street area of St. Catharines. And so it made sense that that's where they built their church. And then in 2015, in commemoration of that time, an elementary school was built on Henry Street called the Harriet Tubman Public School. And there is a bronze statue in their courtyard of Harriet Tubman. And this Black community in the 1850s, it grew to about 500 or 800 people, and it included Harriet Tubman and her family, her mother, whatever siblings she had, were safe there in Canada. Now, interestingly enough, she went back to the United States to continue the fight for freedom, and even led a battalion during the Civil War of Union soldiers. I think she was the first woman to ever lead a battalion of fighters in a war in the US. So, isn't that interesting about her? Now, I'm talking about Harriet Tubman because she had dreams. Now, some people believe she didn't have dreams, she had epileptic fits. Other people believe she had narcolepsy, which means that you suddenly fall asleep, just fall on the ground and fall asleep, which sounds an awful lot like what she'd experienced. She said that she had visions from God, and other people have said that she had dreams. So, say if she did have narcolepsy and she would just suddenly fall asleep. Well, in that sleep, she would have dreams, which, like I said, she called visions. And these dreams or visions would help her to know where is the safe way to take these people that I am taking with me from the slavery states, which was now the whole United States, into the freedom of Canada. So she would get these visions that she, like I said, that she said were from God. And it might tell her, don't take them to this house because those people are against you, but then take them to this place, or don't, don't, don't go left here, go right here. She would get a sense of what was the safe route. And she never lost a person, which is phenomenal considering that they would be running in the dark in the winter. And believe me, the winter in Canada is pretty harsh. And evidently, her family, after the Civil War, when the slaves were freed, they wanted to go back to the United States, to their friends and family. And they also were not really keen on those cold winters in Canada. So let me get back to Harriet Tubman's dreams, because that is what I like to talk about on this YouTube channel. And these were, I've been talking about problem-solving inspired dreams. So these were dreams that gave her answers that helped her out in this really risky business. And to me, the fact that she would suddenly fall asleep from whether it was narcolepsy or I once had a dear friend with epilepsy who had grand mal seizures. He never had a dream in those seizures. So I don't know. He never had a vision or anything, whatever. It doesn't matter what it's called. She got guidance somehow in these visions. And the important thing, and this is the third step in benefiting from working with your dreams, it is to act on what you get in your dreams. In other words, if Harriet Tubman had had one of these dreams or visions that told her, don't go in that direction to the left, go to the right. And she said, I don't want to go to the right because there's a swamp there. I'm going to go to the left instead because it's nice high ground. Well, she would not be acting on what she learned in her dream, and likely they would have been caught if they went to the left.